Hello, everyone. My name is Muthoni Mwangi from African Digital Heritage, and I will be moderating the conversation today. Today, our guest is Courage Dzidula Kpodo. Let me just read a brief, say hi to the people, Courage. Let me
Hi
read a
everyone.
brief description.
Hi everyone. Yeah, I
Um,
am Courage. Thank you all for joining. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Yeah, I'm happy to share, but also very excited to hear what your thoughts are on whatever we discuss today.
Okay, so let me just do a brief introduction. Courage Dzidula Kpodo is a spatial researcher and architect in training. He graduated from the architecture program at KNUST and is in the master's program at MIT. He works with the Nation Building Archive of African States with collaborators in Postbox Ghana and examines them as active materials for engaging today's spatial conditions and the various associations people make with them. So, without further ado, this is Courage. Like I mentioned before, my name is Mwangi, the research associate at African Digital Heritage, and I will be moderating today's conversation.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you.
how are you doing today, Courage?
Doing very good. I am a bit tired just because I traveled yesterday. But yeah, I am looking forward to this conversation. So I am in Boston now, just because the semester is ongoing. So yeah, I'm doing all right. Thank you.
Okay. Courage, you had mentioned that you would like to present a poem for us before we begin the conversation.
Yes. So I will be reading a very short poem by the Ghanaian poet Kofi Awono. The title of the poem is The Cathedral, and I will start. On this dirty patch, a tree once stood, shedding incense on the infant corn, its boughs stretched across a heaven, brightened by the last fires of a tribe. They sent surveyors and builders who cut that tree, planting in its place a huge senseless cathedral of doom. So the poet Kofi Awono is a Ghanaian poet who was born in 1935 and was killed in 2013 in the Westgate shopping mall attack in Nairobi. And I decided to read this poem because he, in this poem specifically, protests this rapid development that is happening and all the tradition that is lost in that process. So he is like this figure that straddles between tradition from his upbringing along the coast of Ghana in the east and his very successful life as a poet and a literary critic and author and all that, and was trying to protest how this development has changed the physical space. So he talks about this tree and a cathedral, and he presents the tree as its own cathedral. We don't need to build something else. And his story of unfortunately being killed in this shopping mall in Nairobi also really reflects how this this element of the urban space, like this public space, is a place for us to meet, but in us meeting in that place also makes us very vulnerable to all kinds of things that can happen. And the Al-Shabaab attacks was just a very extreme example, but there are other kinds of things that happen in public spaces. So I thought this would be a good way to begin the conversation in foregrounding how, at least I like to think about it. The aftermath of the attacks saw all kinds of changes and improvements and tweaks to the public space infrastructure, specifically in Nairobi. I had the opportunity to be there this past summer for about a week. And I just remember going through security check after security check, and yeah, you put your phones in the tray and then you go through that thing.
Yeah.
And there's layers and layers of it, depending on what kinds of spaces you're trying to get into. So yeah, this phenomena of public space interests me quite a lot, and I thought, yeah, it could be a way to begin this conversation.
Thank you so much for sharing the poem. Thank you so much for sharing the poem. It's interesting that today we're talking about space because I'm in one of my favorite spaces in Nairobi that I'd like to do something work. It's called Cheche Bookshop and Cafe. The next time you're around, you should come check it out. And there's so many things happening today. Like there's so many people inhabiting the space. And I don't know, I was just thinking about like the capacity of a space to hold such different things, like different events, different people, different gatherings at the same time. I think there's something in there about space making and space holding. But with that, I'd like us to go into the conversation. So my first question for you is like, what was your journey like? What led you here to digital archiving, to thinking about space, and of course, with your training, like clear to see the link, but really what moves you, what moves you and what brought you here?
Yeah, I think in many ways, many things brought me here. But if I were to point to maybe some very specific instances or set of instances that were very formative for me, I think the first thing would be the figure of my father. So my father is called Edward, and he is a bookmaker and a publisher, and he has been doing that since he was 17 years old. He didn't go to university. After his secondary school, he went to apprentice with his dad, who had a big publishing house. And they would make all these books, including children's books from all over the African continent, because they had a lot of these projects. And now that I think about it, my dad had a very active archiving process, but he was archiving for us. So what he would do is he would keep 2 or 3 copies of every book that the company made. And so we just had like trunk loads of books. And I remember reading these and being introduced to all these stories and cultures around the continent. And they all had illustrations, very interesting and beautiful hand-drawn illustrations in them. So I think as a kid, what that does to your mind is you suddenly begin to think in terms of, spatial, like in spatial terms. And yes, I didn't know I would be an architect at the time. But I think that was really early grounding. That was probably the first archive I ever encountered. And yeah, I studied the fine arts for some time. So I did painting, sculpture. I did graphic design as well. And in that, I think I was able to become a lot more interested in these various art forms and how that could become some kind of profession later. I also had a lot of interest in the technical sciences. I wanted to try and merge the two, and someone advised me that architecture would be a good fit. So in a way, that's what led me to architecture. But to go back, I think, yes, my interest in architecture, or like my primary interest in it, would always be the archive and the things that came before, and those elements that would point to how space was made and thought about 50 years ago, 100 years ago, even 10 years ago. Those things really interested me, because I like to imagine the lives that other people lived. And yeah, and in many ways too, it's very good material for the work I do as an architect, which is constantly imagining something that is to come. And we never create in a vacuum, so it's like the more references you can have up here, then the more iterations or a variety of things you can make, addressing some issue, of course. So yeah, that's like a kind of quick summary of yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing with us. I think it's really cool that your dad is a bookmaker and that he kept for you guys books. Because I can imagine that's a very rich personal like family archive that I hope you still have, but I don't know if you still have it.
Yeah, we still have a few of them. Some of them got lost along the way, but we still have a few of them. But what's important, most of them are up here. Yeah.
Well, that's good. That's good. I would like us to just begin thinking together about space making. I guess my first question for you is how does the archive sorry, let me rephrase. What does the archive bring to your ideas of space making? Like when you're I guess you said it helps with your, like, as an architect, like looking at the archive and imagining what's possible, seeing what has happened before. But I'm interested in you telling us more about that, and how it informs your practice. Yeah, and how it informs your practice.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I think here I should mention Postbox Ghana. So that's a group that a collaborative research practice that I run with Manuela Nebuloni and Kantinka. I think Manuela should be on the call. Kantinka couldn't join us today. But I mentioned them because it was my first very active engagement with the archive in a very specific form, in the form of postcards. And I'll talk some more about that. So I'm from Ghana, as I've already said, and Ghana gained independence in 1957. So the first president, Kwame Nkrumah, along with many other presidents of newly independent African states. So Nkrumah was very good friends with a number of them. There was a general sense of Pan-Africanism around the late 50s and early 60s that many of these first presidents subscribed to. So Kwame Nkrumah, along with these other presidents, were quite intent on creating a certain language and space for the newly independent country. And so they adopted the language of tropical modernism in the socialist style because they were more aligned with the socialists than the capitalists of the West. And so what ended up happening is that we had this focus manifested in very concrete modernist buildings that you find in a lot of the cities of African countries, like the main capitals. You would find a lot of these main, like, very large brutalist concrete buildings, which were new and modern at the time and super exciting and evoked this feeling of we're a new country, we have a new identity, let's do away with all the colonial buildings and let's express our newfound identity. And so for me, looking back at this through the lens of postcards, archival drawings that are found in the development offices around the country, or even archival offices that are found in like cities overseas, looking back at that time through this lens and being here today, it occurs to me, or like it seems to me that that was a very active time in which they were trying to formulate a certain identity. And I think back through that, from that point till now, and even before, and I can't find any kind of time when we were so active and intent on, formulating a certain identity and being very intentional about it. And so in many ways, I think we're at a certain point where, because of technology, digital heritage, social media, etc., we are beginning to have those conversations again. We're beginning to talk amongst ourselves. This Zoom call is a manifestation of that, right? Because sadly enough, and I think probably same goes for you, never really interacted with people outside of the country much. We didn't know each other growing up, but suddenly with social media, it's like, yeah, we're not that far apart from each other. We're thinking about the same things. We have the same struggles, we have the same issues, we have the same hopes, and we have the same fears. And I think, yes, that is making us start to rethink what our identity is. And it's in various forms. It's in our literature, and it's in our architecture, it's in our poetry, it's in our films, it's in all kinds of productions that we engage with. And so for me, it's important that now that we're at that stage, that we're able to have this conversation, we need to know what was done before and need to understand it and interrogate it very deeply. Because yes, as much as I pride myself on being a Ghanaian, I still remember that I am an Ewe, and the Ewe language should make me a citizen of 4 different countries, right? Because that language is spoken, or like my tribe is kind of split across these 4 different countries. So logically, I should be a citizen of those 4 different countries, but here I am calling myself a Ghanaian, and I have pride in that. But we need to interrogate it. The act of independence and the creation of a national identity wasn't truly democratic in that sense. And so now that we are at the stage where we are beginning to, think anew about what our identities are, we need to really understand what was done before, so we don't maybe make the same mistakes, but also so we can draw lessons from what was done before. What we end up doing won't be perfect, but I think it will be a step better if we're able to interrogate what was done before. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think the idea of the past and present being in conversation with each other and the archive informing our practice right now is very big. At least for me, it's very big in my practice. I'm interested. You said you're a member of the Ewe tribe that you said is in 4 countries, and you mentioned the idea of independence and peacemaking. I think for me that's brought up just the question and the idea that we often grapple with of different groups existing and living across borders, but then having borders then now imposed on us from the Berlin Conference, and then now this is Kenya or this is Ghana, and your people belong to different, like your people are spread over different countries. I'm wondering, I guess for you, what it means for your identity to be sitting with that kind of this discord, I think internal discord, because you mentioned that yes, you're proud to be Ghanaian, but you're also aware. So I'm curious about that relationship.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. It's a very hard question, and I am still trying to understand it. As a matter of fact, I was in Berlin just a few days ago, because you mentioned the Berlin conference, and I spent some time in the Prussian archives. So the Prussians and the Brandenburgers were a monarchy in Berlin, and then they founded a company that was doing expeditions in what is today West Africa. So they were trading between West Africa and the US islands, so where you have the St. Helena Islands and the US Virgin Islands. And yeah, it was very, being in the archive and going through all these materials, I didn't understand what they said because it was all in German and Dutch, but just going through it and seeing the words, I was like, oh, I know this place. I know Cape Coast. I know Takrady. I know Ouidah. I know Dahomey, in this very foreign land. And, these were letters, decisions were being made. And yeah, my identity now and how I feel now is a consequence of, those writings that I saw. And it was very, I don't know what the word is, profound, I guess. Yeah, I felt something for sure when I was there, just going through these hundreds of pages of documents. But last month also I had traveled with my colleagues in Postbox Ghana to Ouidah in Benin. So we did the road trip from Ghana across into Togo and then Ouidah. And I have very, very extended family in Togo. So by very extended, I mean it's my aunt's cousin's husband. Yeah, super extended. But we're not that different, right? But I had a very hard time communicating with him because he spoke a different dialect of Ewe, and his dialect of Ewe was more influenced by the French, and my dialect of Ewe was more influenced by the English. So even though I could speak I could speak his, there was a bit of a disconnect just because of what had been superimposed onto those languages. But of course, we're brethren. You feel that you are brethren, right? And I think I am lucky now to be in a position where I can travel like this. I don't think my parents even get a chance to think about these things. For them, it's been Ghana most of their life, and that's all they know. They were born in the early 70s, and there wasn't much reason to travel beyond the borders. You kind of stayed within where you were. But for me, being a cultural worker, an architect, and just also being curious, I found the need to travel. And I was surprised. In Benin, yeah, I could speak Ewe and they would understand. And I was like, whoa, okay. I knew you were here, but now that I am facing it, it's like someone puts a mirror up to your face after 30 years of not looking at your face, right? Then you're like, who are you? You know? So in that way, it was very profound. And I don't know, it just dawned on me that this thing about we need to talk to each other is super, super important. And yeah, if we can ever imagine a future where we create something, make space for ourselves, yes, these conversations need to happen. And I feel quite strongly about this. And yeah, in many ways too, it's just like evocative of the amount of work that we need to do. We need to have those conversations now. Yeah, so yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think, yeah, sorry, the concept you brought in the concept of gathering and just like talking to each other and having conversations. And I think that's really important to, I guess, forming our identities, but also taking up space and reclaiming space. Because earlier in the week when we talked, I was asking if you've been on the journey to Nairobi CBD. If you live in Nairobi, you know how using public transport to go into the CBD is absolutely hellish, and navigating the CBD.
Yeah.
And the few spaces for rest, the few spaces for us to just sit and gather. So I thank you for bringing in just the concept of like us gathering and needing to talk to each other. I'm interested in what dreams like you have, because I think space making and visual archiving, also community archiving, because I saw also on the Postbox Ghana that you make call outs to the community. You are looking for people to help you find an architect or an architect's work.
Grapher.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. So I'm interested to hear about your experience with community archiving, but also just community archiving. Then we'll go into the next question. Yeah.
All right. No, thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. I think I don't want to sound like, the cliche of working with community and like that kind of buzzword now. I have a bit of an opposition to it because I think it is overused and sometimes not treated very well. But I do think it is very important to cultivate a community. I think, maybe cultivate is the right word, like, and be a steward of the community where you are serving it, but you also have a certain responsibility towards, caring for it. So yeah, the project you bring up is very interesting. So there is a photographer called Kweku Bonsu, and he was operating in Ghana, we think in the 60s. We found his work through postcards that Manuela, who's on the call, and also part of Postbox, had collected. And these postcards, mind you, weren't collected from Ghana. They were collected from overseas. So there was a time when the newly formed identity of the country was marketed or like advertised on these postcards. And so if you were sending a letter to a friend outside of the country, then you'd buy one of these postcards, and most likely around the 60s, it would have an image of one of these new modernist buildings, which were in Accra or Takoradi or in Kumasi. And so 60 years down the line, there are these postcards that are in circulation around the world. And for some reason, people are selling them on the internet. So we have been buying these postcards and putting them together and trying to see the narratives and the stories and the different authors that ran through them. So in that exercise, we came across this man, this photographer, Kweku Bonsu. And we found his work interesting because he had a quite distinct eye for architecture. So his images had this very images were all in black and white, and they had a very sharp contrast, felt very heavy. It wasn't all about, happiness. There was a certain heaviness to his images, which kind of pulls you in. And we were interested in that. So he wasn't the only photographer we found, of course. Altogether, there's like 25, 27 different photographers and photographic studios who were operating after independence. And there is little to none information about them out there. We decided to pick this photographer as an entry point and see what might come out of that. And so in line with how we think about, where can we look for an already mode of gathering information or spreading information that exists in their city. And yeah, in Ghana, in Kumasi, in Accra, and I'm sure even in Nairobi, you have a lot of these very large scale billboards that are always advertising some product or service, and they're quite efficient and also they can be expensive to rent. They are very expensive to build, for sure, but they can also be very expensive to rent. So for us, this super small scale, like this is the size of a postcard, right? Like this, making that into the size of a billboard, like something super monumental, which was evocative of all these monuments that were built, in the 60s, would be one quite artistic and provocative project, of course, but also would serve as the function of, getting information, like really putting this image out there and then finding out if there's any descendants or relatives or people who even knew him, right? And then getting that information. And so in doing that, we had to reach out to the billboard company. I think they were also a bit perplexed because they maybe don't usually get these requests, but they were very interested is the thing. I think the newness of this kind of project where it's like you're not advertising for a service or you're not trying to get people to buy your thing. Okay, interesting. So why are you doing it? Like there's all these questions that come up, but once they understand, they're like, oh, okay, I think I see, I see the importance, and they become very supportive and all that. So yes, it was on 31st of December of 2023. So yeah, it's about a month, almost 2 months ago now that we did the mounting of the billboard. And from that time till now, we have had one person call us saying that he's the grandson of this photographer. And we're still in talks with them, and hopefully this leads somewhere, right? So in a way, we're also just like testing the waters out with this mode of display. And yeah, hopefully we could maybe do more billboards in the future or maybe some other form, but really trying to like interrogate this, get more information about who was operational then, and then really trying to like get the archive, but also make use of the archive in contemporary forms is what we're trying to do. So yeah.
Someone has asked, oh, it's okay, it's been shared, the Postbox Ghana. Thank you, Manuela, for sharing in the chat. I think you've highlighted the shared struggle that we all have as archivists, as I guess contemporary archivists working in Africa with African indigenous cultures and even African histories, like even the idea of the call out, which is something that also happens in Nairobi. There's this company called Book Bank who are collecting stories about the museum, the Macmillan Museum in Nairobi. Like that process it's a very interesting one to me, but it's, I think also what I was saying earlier, it kind of speaks to the community archiving aspect where we're tapping into a communal memory of a thing and not like what's written in a book. And I feel like there's something interesting to be explored there about our histories. And then now with the advent of digital archiving, like there's so much to add to the archive. And I think it helps us create our own idea of an archive and also kind of bridge that silence, because often when you approach the Western archive, it's either a silence concerning like with regards to our histories or just the Western gaze, and that's not our story. So yeah. think that's pretty cool. So my next question is, I think you had mentioned just the idea of looking to the past or looking to what's been done before to imagine what space could look like, or what space making could be. So I think for me that spoke to just the idea of space making and dream casting, and like having like it being like a seed of fodder for you to explore your wildest imaginations. So could you tell us a bit more about that and how, if that manifests for you, and and like your process?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. So yeah, I definitely think, we create something based on something we've experienced. And a classic example is you ask a child to draw a house, and they'll probably, make a roof and make some walls because they've seen that's what a house looks like. If they haven't seen it, they cannot conceptualize it. And yeah, there are things that maybe I have seen here I could mention. You don't have any frame of reference for it. So yeah, then if you don't have that, then how can you, even create in the first place? So there's an act of translation that happens between the past, the present, and the future when you're creating, for sure. And I mean, in answer to this question, I do want to focus more on maybe the present, or we term the present. So yes, in referring to, everything that has been done before, there still are quite contemporary issues that did not maybe exist before then, or that do not necessarily speak to what was done before. So it's a kind of double work where it's like, yes, you need to learn from history, but there are incredible, like, we're living within a present archive. And yes, we need to interrogate that also to a degree. And I am bringing that up because I think it's important not to fall into the place of thinking that, oh, these past buildings were quite good, and, this whole let's go back to the past thing. Yeah, I mean, it's something that I'm still thinking about, like, constantly. But I think, yes, we cannot easily go back to the past. Yes, we need to do away with the borders, but we need to understand that the borders have made us into different kinds of people. And we need to a degree, respect those differences if we hope to actually, like, move forward. Otherwise, these problems will manifest in very, physical ways. So yeah, our contemporary issues of climate change, of I don't know, terrorist attacks, all of that is, there's still things that we need to grapple with. Security, social media, digital heritage. We need to try and bring that into the space where we create. And yeah, and I think it is crucial for us to do that, so we don't like keep regurgitating all these mistakes that have been done in the past. So yeah, sorry, I twisted the question to focus more on the present, but I wanted to give some space for that.
Oh, no, that's all right. That's all right. I just I wanted to ask this for you. Is there anything you would like to share with us, like about Postbox Ghana, or any work of yours that you felt like very, very passionately about, that you just want to tell everyone about?
Well, when you put me on the spot like that, I'm like trying to think of something.
Or you could, okay, you can take some time to think of it.
Yes, thank
You
you.
could take some time to think about it. Okay, so we can move forward, and the next question is, like, Postbox Ghana is a digital archive. In that it exists in the digital realm, you can access it. I've seen that you're expanding your archival practice to from just looking at space to also looking at objects, and looking at the music that accompanies those objects, and the communities and the dances that accompany those objects. And okay, so that in the later post. And I'm curious to how you got to digital I mean, okay, digital archiving is a method, of course, for preservation. I'm curious about some of the tools you use or you've encountered along the way that you'd like to share, and some of the ways that this work of digital archiving has called you to question and imagine what an archive can be, what a digital archive can be. Yeah.
No, thank you for that. I think in many ways for African like social spaces, because there isn't a certain physical infrastructure that enables these conversations to happen, we are quote unquote forced to resort to another mode that works, which is, of course, the digital archive. And because it's free, it's not very expensive, and we can do things from relatively very large distances, right? So it would be very expensive for us to organize this call, for instance. Not this call, for us to organize this meeting in person in Nairobi. The logistics would be quite insane. So in a way, we are kind of leapfrogging that whole infrastructural need, like we're skipping it altogether. And it works, but I think my fear, like, that thing in the back of my mind that is like, oh, think about this more. It's good, but it shouldn't be the only thing. Is that, yes, we can become, this could become our only frame of reference. And to be fair, there is something that is definitely lost in that. So yes, even Instagram, where we post our archives and even experiment with ways of showing the archive, whether it's through videos, it's through pictures, it's through reorganizing the grid that Instagram gives you, it's through sound overs and not necessarily some visual thing. Even in that, because of Instagram's architecture, there are some things that will be lost. And for me, I'm very interested in those losses, and I think we should pay attention to them, because it might not be something that we realize now, but then with time we realize that, oh yeah, there are certain things that we have forgotten. So in as much as I am thankful for social media and the digital space and all that, I still have I think a healthy criticism of what it can and what it cannot do. So yes, we should have it, but we should be, in many ways, we should be using it as a tool towards the creation of maybe some more physical space or some other, no, it doesn't even have to be physical, but some other alternative spaces where we can meet. And yes, architecture, like architectural thinking, could play a role in this, but it also comes from us not confining what architecture is to just physical space. Yeah, so
Yeah, I think you've actually highlighted that gap when you're talking about the gap between like the digital manifestation of the thing and the like just the building itself. I think for me, it's been interesting, especially with the work African Digital Heritage has done with 3D reconstructions, is the other way where the digital helping you reclaim the actual story that was lost and to kind of fill in the gaps, because now the detention camps became other things, and we did a project reconstructing a theater, the Kamujisi Theater, early last year, which is a theater, very revolutionary story, but because it happened during a period of dictatorship, then the building was razed to the ground. They built something else on top of that space. So I feel like from still the thing that that the digital helps us reclaim the stories themselves, like that gap, they feed each other.
yeah.
And I feel like that's why community archiving is important, because we collect stories. We collected the stories from the actors themselves. They told us their personal accounts, and that's how we were able to digitally reconstruct the space itself. And I guess that's why this space is like we're working on the digital humanities, because we're not only leaning towards digitization and the digital realm, but we're also thinking about the people and the stories that we need to preserve and the cultures that we need to honor. Yeah, so I think that was just me
No,
giving
it's
you
yeah,
like some of the lessons from our end about like now digitizing,
yeah,
sorry, while also keeping the cultural aspect, making sure the kind of metadata,
yeah,
if we can call it, the metadata isn't lost.
yeah.
Um,
It's
yeah, in
yeah.
the
No,
digitizing.
it's very interesting you bring that up. I like what you said about the building that was raised down, and then you create a footprint of it in the digital realm, and it makes me think of um postmodernism and the rise of science. So for for a sign of something to exist, that means the real thing does not exist anymore, or the real thing is unimportant, or we do not want to show the real thing. So I find this interesting because it's something that I experience like increasingly here in the West and in Europe in general. There was this room that I stayed in, and when I entered the room, the TV just had a video playing of, like a bonfire, and it was meant to make you feel warm or something. And it was a sign of a bonfire, but it's very common practice there for these things to exist. And I was thinking, why can't we have an actual what's the issue with that, right? And so in many ways, so I try to think of this in relation to digital footprints or like things. Yes, it's important for us to scan it or try to recreate some digital footprint of it. But the flip side of that is that if we have a digital footprint, then yeah, we do not maybe need the real thing. You could experience it from a digital space with, your Apple VR headset thing, the new one they released. Yeah, you kind of get that. And we're making strides towards that, where you could, to a degree, feel like you're actually in the real thing. And I don't know how this makes me feel, or like what my position is on this clearly, but it's not a new thing. Like the postcards are like a representation, they're a sign of something larger, and it's a more abstract, scaled down representation of it. And in many ways, we have that material as that thing that is present with us. Maybe the building does not exist anymore. And as a matter of fact, some of those buildings were demolished when the government changed due to, political revolutions and things. But yeah, like the extreme of that is that, because the sign exists, then we do not need the real thing. And I wonder what that means for us as physical, like, will this become our physical space in the future? Is that something we want? I guess is my question. And it's not to you, it's to myself and to, to
Yeah,
everyone in the room, I guess. But
I think
I
that
think, yeah,
I
go
think
on,
that's,
sorry.
yeah, that's something you are right. Like just something you have at the back of your mind, because even like with the idea of restitution, and when we're thinking about objects that need to be restituted, as much as we're
Yes,
trying to tell the story of the object and
yes,
reconstruct the object, the conversation of restitution has not ended. We still need the return of the object.
yes.
Um, so yeah, I think that's an important thing to note, like for all of us in all of our different practices. Just I guess try to find a way. Trying to find ways to preserve our histories in the digital without making them obsolete in
Yeah,
in the
yeah,
physical world. Um,
exactly.
I'm wondering, I have a question. We were thinking, you were telling us about the dorm room and the fire, and it had me
Yes.
thinking about the limitations of space. Because in that space, like, yes, you would like to have the fire, but how possible would
How
that be?
possible is that?
So,
Yeah.
yeah, so I don't know. What have the limitations, like, have you thought what limitations about space have you encountered in your
Yeah.
practice? And how do you feel about those limitations? How do you navigate those limitations, and how do they influence maybe your imagining of
Mhm.
what space would look like?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, yeah, it's a very, very good question, right? Because yeah, could we have the bonfire in the room? there's some variation of a bonfire in a room. They call it a chimney, right? But in today, the real estate agent will tell you, no, you need to make as much profit per square meter as you can. So you do not need the chimney. It's a lot of costs, it's a lot of maintenance, it's all that. So what do? You have this centralized heating system. And then to, make people feel good, you just put a thing on the screen. So spatially, it can be done because we, in many ways, have done it. But we are existing in a society which is driven by money flows and capital. And in many ways, the architect or the one who creates the space actually does not make the decisions. You'll be approached by a client, and the client will have his real estate guy behind him who's like, these are the floor plans. We just need you to make a facade which looks nice. And in many cases, that's the reality. And unless you have some, you're on your, like you're your own real estate agent, or you have a super compelling argument, then in most cases, the things that bring the soul to a place gets pushed to the sidelines for profit. And I'm saying this as a kind of Western experience, right? But also in our countries, I'm guessing you've seen the government is not really that interested in like providing these public spaces to even begin with. And the question is, why are they not interested? It's because they're expensive. They have to maintain them. It doesn't bring profit to them. It doesn't things. There's all kinds of indirect benefits. Don't get me wrong. Like, we know that if you have a lot of public parks, people are happier. They work better in the offices and all that. But yeah, the government wants something that is quick just because of how the economy is. We need things to move quickly. We can't wait for those indirect benefits. We need the direct benefits, right? And so we are going to rather sell off that land that could be a park to that investor that has $1 billion to build a high rise or a big thing.
Let
So
me tell you about Nairobi and shopping mall. There is
exactly.
a shopping mall, like every one just next to the other, next to
Everywhere,
the other, next to the
everywhere,
other.
because of profits, no? But also, what
Yeah,
is interesting here,
definitely.
it's important to know what is interesting here is that people will always find a way to appropriate already existing systems to their own benefit. So yeah, I would call my friend and be like, hey, let's meet at the mall. We're not going to buy something. We're just going there to meet, right? And so we might have to buy a bottle of water or something, in some cases. But then that becomes our public space. There's all kinds of public spaces that exist outside of the canon of what a Western public space is. And in many ways, we have that. Of course, they are not super efficient. There's a mall in Kumasi. I went there to just eat breakfast. I had my food with me, like I cooked, and then I took it there. And the security guy came and told me that I cannot eat there. And I said, why? This is just open space. I'm just here eating. He said, no. Here you have to buy the food that is from one of these restaurants. And it's super expensive, by the way. So even the commodification of public space then becomes a thing. But yeah, the mall is one instance. There are all kinds of other instances that might not appear as public spaces, but in many ways they are. And I like to even think of, the church as a kind of public space. So for me, I think I don't believe the African church is an entirely Western introduction. It's been Africanized in many, many ways. Like, the kinds of clapping and singing and dancing that happens in the church, you won't find that in the church here. And the fact that every week people religiously, literally and metaphorically, people religiously go to these spaces, to worship, but also to meet each other, like everyone, and gossip, family gossips and things. They all happen in that space. The church is a public space. So I'm not maybe the biggest proponent of religion in Africa, but I do recognize the fiscal value of the church as a space. And I think it's very important for us to really start to think about what are those forms of public spaces that do exist in our context. And then, I think once we know what those ones are, then maybe if we're thinking about them, we can think about them differently, or start to incorporate like new ideas around them and how they are used. But yeah.
Thank you so much for bringing in the point about reappropriating the spaces, like even like turning spaces into public space. Yeah, so as we wrap up, have you had some time to think about my question about what like some of the work you're most proud of so far?
So I like what we did with the billboards because it was very new territory. And I'm really glad we were able um to to do it. And I think it's like we've done it and we're like sitting back and we're just getting these calls from people who are like, giving us information, and then we'll have to meet them and build all these relations. So it's very, very exciting in that regard. One other project, which maybe isn't necessarily related to Postbox, but that I find interesting in terms of this idea of we need to talk to each other, is there's a film that I worked on in 2021. It's called Certain Winds from the South. Um, I'm just typing it in the group now. Yeah, and it's based on a story by a Ghanaian poet and author called Ama Ata Edu, who unfortunately passed last year. Very brilliant, like, yeah, she's the best, really. But the process of making this was really interesting because here I was an architect, right? And this guy who was a photographer who was interested in experimenting with film came to me, and then we began to talk about how this could manifest. And not to give too much about it, but I ended up building and designing this set for the film, which was a circular compound, like how they build in the north of Ghana traditionally. They build in circles, and then you have rooms along the circles. And in the middle of that center is where we put the camera. So if you can imagine the camera moving 360 degrees, like continuously, that becomes the film. So every revolution, every 360 degree then becomes like a scene or an act, which was in the original story. The original story was written like a play, so it's like a continuous story. So we tried to do that with the film as well. So it became this long, continuous 40-minute video that was, that was shot from just one location and with very, very minimal budget just by doing that. And it's not something we could have maybe we pre-planned or like knew exactly how it would come out. But from that collaboration, I learned things that I really had no idea about, about the camera, about how to position and what to put in the frame, what you decide to show, what you decide not to show. I didn't know much of that, but just that process alone like gave me so much. And I'm highlighting the project as the richness that we are all left with when we talk to each other. And it doesn't have to be just professions, also across borders. Like I'm leaving this call with so much, and I'm sure you all are too. So yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing. I'll definitely be looking out that film. Sounds very interested. It's very interesting. One like the last question before we go into the question and answer. What are some ways that you're thinking of expanding your archiving practice? Maybe this year or like right now, some ideas you're having.
Thank you for that. So we do have like a few projects going on. So yeah, this is not me expanding our practice. It's us, and us I mean myself, Kantinka and Manuela. We're thinking collectively on how to expand this. But we do have a few projects going on along the coast of West Africa, and it has to do with this idea of connection. So I mean, I'm thinking if I should share, like it's not, the project is not out yet, so I'm like, how much should I share? No. But it talks about the themes of like it looks at connection and like movement through the lens of these plants. So there are several plants in West Africa, at least, that are not from West Africa, but we grew up with them. So you might think they're native, but they're actually not. So cocoa, coffee, like a lot of these things are coming from different places over the centuries as people were moved and all these trades were happening. So we're trying to look at the complexities of that. And I think the outcome will be some kind of exhibition, probably very large scale, very urban, out there, something along the lines of what the billboards were doing. But looking at this story of like movement, migration, and like people and cultures and all that. So yeah, I'm super excited for that. It will probably hopefully be out at the end of this year. So yeah, if you follow the page, the link that Manuela put in the group, then yeah, you can follow and see how that is going. But yeah, super excited.
All right. I'm excited as well. So we have some questions here for you. Are you ready for the first one?
Yes, let's go.
Okay, so in our world of Pinterest and global influence in architectural design, how can African cultures thrive in space making and help build truly contextual space?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. I remember architecture school where yeah, there was this stigma around, oh yeah, oh, you're going to Pinterest, you're stealing your ideas, and all these things. Yeah, that was some time ago, but it's very interesting seeing it or hearing it in this context now. I definitely think our associations as African people is what should drive what we end up designing. And let me be a bit more specific. So our associations, I don't consider those necessarily things that were done 100 years ago. We actually may not be associating with those things. If we are, then fine. Then I think it would be good for us to influence. Because yes, we are designing spaces in time, like maybe this year, in the next 5 years or something. So there's a particular group of users who will be using it, right? But also the thing is, at least as architects, whatever we build ends up lasting in the environment for a very, very long time, even after we're dead and gone. So all the kind of things that we designed it for might not necessarily be the case in 100 years. But of course, we have to hope and trust that we've done the work, that people will be able to use it in whatever way works for them in that future. But at least in the context that we are present in, like in the place and in the time, we should be drawing from, those things that we are associated with. So when I think African culture of like today, for me, I'm like, I have a group of friends that are very funky. They like the colors. They draw these references from all around the world. And in doing that, they are creating their own kind of identity, which is equally African. It will be a disservice to kind of consider that as not African and say that is Western because it's picking up these sources, right? I'm speaking English, but that in some way should be considered a kind of African thing. I'm speaking it with certain specific intonations and, they call it the accents, but even that is a manifestation of a certain Africanness. So there was a time when I used to, of course, think that what is African is, the traditional, the mud huts, and I don't have anything against those, but I do think that if we are like based on the context, the place, the people who are designing for, the people who are designing, like whoever we have in mind, yeah, it's important to know what associations they have and what works best for them in that context of the place and today's time. So yeah, thank you for the question. It's a very good question.
Thank you so much for answering that question for us. The next question is, what problems do architects and planners face when they try to include traditional African ways of building in modern projects?
It's also a very strong question. So I think there's maybe a few things that are quite challenging. So yes, we all know most of our countries are along the equator, and we experience a lot of sunlight, and just from a technical viewpoint, it makes sense to actually build with the quote unquote traditional materials that we were building with 100 years ago. It still works for today's context. It doesn't change because the sun hasn't moved. The sun isn't going from north to south instead of east to west, right? So it still applies. But for some reason, we're building with glass and, like all these things. And nothing against those materials. They can be done in a very intelligent way. Glass can be used and still be super effective, even in our context. But yeah, a certain intelligence and thinking of how then we use this is important. And that's maybe where the problem comes when the client has a certain association of modernity to whatever the material you're using is. So someone might think, the earth material is backward. And it is very challenging. I've had a few of that sometimes. And yeah, you might go into the space thinking, oh, I'm going to try and convince them so they can understand where I'm coming from and all that. But some people are also quite dogmatic, right? And what I have found, though, that maybe I can offer is that if something has been done once, people have a frame of reference and it's easier to do the next thing. So in many ways, it's like you only need that one client. It's very hard finding that one client also. So in my mind, I'm like, if you can be your own client and build that thing and actually demonstrate that this works, then you have a much, much easier time of like, people like of explaining why this works to people. Because for most people, they don't have that kind of association. Yeah, but if we can demonstrate it, then in many ways our work becomes easier. It's one of the main problems, to be fair. And it exists at both the individual clients level, but also at like the city states, because there's all kinds of politics. They want to project a certain image. And they might not be willing to give you money to build this, experimental mud structure that goes 5 stories, because they're like, that's not the kind of image we have in mind, So yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for answering that question for us. There's something you said about starting the thing, like doing the thing first, and people having a frame of reference. I think that's very important, and it's a very big thing in the cultural heritage sector, especially with regards to now innovation of new ways of archiving, of preserving our cultures. And honestly, a lot of the time we just have to be the one to take the leap and hope other people see it and are like, it's possible. So let's try as well. Yeah. And then now, apart from the limitations, which successes have you experienced?
I think the successes, yeah, they come with maybe a group like this, a group of open-minded people who are willing to learn. And so in many ways, the work also comes in finding those people and then having a conversation, because you cannot do it on your own. You can start on your own, but you cannot do it on your own. You can have a kind of initial thing, but you cannot do it on your own. So finding those people that are aligned is usually more helpful than fighting an uphill battle of someone who might not be aligned. So yeah, in a short way, I think that's maybe the success, but also points to how we can operate as thinkers or like archivists. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely like the idea of working with many people like who are of collective will and just like working together when we're one mind and working towards an idea. Yeah, so the next question is, how can we hold our governments more accountable when it comes to thinking about the construction and maintenance of public space?
Wow.
It's a big one.
Yeah, it's a very big one. So I don't know, maybe 2 routes. The first route is maybe become a politician and hopefully not get corrupted enough to forget everything you started with, and then actually use that power that you have to make sure those projects exist. Because to be fair, some people are doing it. Some politicians are doing it, and it's very nice to see. Doesn't happen often, for sure, but when it does, it's really nice to see, right? So yeah, all hope is not lost. I think, yes, but maybe being a politician is, of course, the super extreme thing. Another way is to build this close connection with like whoever is in charge of doing it, or like become their friend. And it's the quote unquote African way of doing things. You know how we don't send emails and things? You make a phone call after you sent an email to make sure the person has read the email. I think that that relation still exists. And in many ways, we should be in good faith cultivating that relationship with the people that actually have the power to make these projects happen. And yeah, I don't subscribe to the view that, you know, all politicians are bad or they don't want to create public spaces, or I think it's more nuanced than that. I think there are people who would like to do it, and there are probably a lot more people who would not want to work on these projects, right, of public spaces. But there's probably a few who would like to do it, and yeah, they may be existing in a space where they haven't had a, yeah, they don't know the other people outside. Like, we're not talking to each other, so it's like we wouldn't really know, right? I'm saying this as someone who's tried to initiate a kind of government connected project, and it went slower than things I've done on my own, for sure. But yeah, what I can say in truth and in all honesty is that yes, there were people who were super interested and wanted this to happen. They were interested. They were like, "Oh yeah, no, this is good for the city, you know. Yeah, come give us a presentation and all that." And I'm still in talks with them, by the way. So, yeah. Another way out of this is to position yourself in a way that you do not need the you know the government, because if the government is not holding it accountable, then how can you as a private individual have enough capital to be able to do this? So it's like, to be an architect, you need to be a businessman, or you need to understand how money flows and then use that flow of money to then go into building something, right? Yeah, there's of course political will that you would need to have for some projects to happen, depending on where the project is, right? But usually it's easier if you have capital, and it's just the truth of the matter. Like, yeah, wherever there's money, things seem to move faster, I guess. Yeah.
Isn't the capitalism again?
Yeah, it's you should not lose your soul, but you need it. Yeah, it's like working with because we are all capitalists to a degree, and to deny that would be a disservice, but also quite dangerous, actually, you know. So yeah, we need to understand we're all complicit to a certain degree, but we need to also like try to provide alternatives to it, even as we're in it. Yeah, it's very important. Otherwise, yeah, we will never create what we need. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this insight. So the last question we have for you is, are there any resources that you can recommend that can help with someone who's working on an archiving project in Africa?
Okay. Wow. I'm not sure what type of resources, but I do think there's, outside of the continent, there's increasingly a number of grants like towards digital archiving that has to do with the themes of there's a variety of themes, but they all kind of refer to what is the global south. So it's like improving in some way the condition of the global south, whether it's like areas that are at risk of the climate, the climate change effects, how to alleviate that, or like how to create some footprints of that so everything is not totally lost. There's a lot of funds now that are increasingly going towards that. So I would maybe point that out as a place to start. And yeah, it's unfortunate that it's coming from outside the continent, but it's what exists like right now in the moment. And that's for more like very large scale high stuff. But to do that, you already need to have a certain like record of having done something, however small it is. And so in that, I would suggest, yeah, what is the thing that is super available? Like Zoom is, Instagram is, like it needs to start somewhere. Postbox Ghana started as an Instagram project. And yeah, in the past 3-4 years, we have been quite, fortunate to be able to exhibit in a few locations around the world. That has come with some small resources that we've then been using to expand on our practice and all that. So short answer is, I guess, start somewhere. Yeah.
So you start somewhere, you're right. There is this comment from Banji Trona in the chat, backtracking a little bit, but Francis Carey's principles of architectural design are a wonderful example of a sort of hybrid style of which takes into account the importance of materials, especially those that are climate efficient and found in vernacular architecture and use indigenous techniques.
Yes.
Like you mentioned, but within the context of the present day.
Yes.
Yeah, so just do that research. Just
Perry
highlight
is an amazing guy. You know,
yeah.
I actually, in Berlin, I went to his office. He's doing some really interesting work there. I think it's also important to, you know, think about how he funds all these projects that you're referencing. So I know in Burkina Faso, he does not have an architectural office, but he has the Career Foundation. And that's more like a workshop where they innovate. It's very hands-on. They're actually making things instead of, you know, drawing behind a computer. But the way he makes that possible is that, you know, he has this foundation, so he's able to get maybe funding from the German government, or but also he subsidizes a lot of the things he does back home by having an office in Europe, which, you know, pays a certain amount of money and makes it possible for him to do things back home. So I think also understanding that is very key. Because yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. There was also someone who asked about some funding options and resources in the chat. Wairimo has shared some links to African Digital Heritage Skills for Culture program that covers like funding, it covers digitization, it covers partnerships, and it can be found on the website with the links provided. So we are almost coming to the end of our time. So Courage, is there anything else you would like to tell us today?
I want it to be a casual fact. So let me check. I am in Boston now, and I have to go to the studio and it is 3 degrees Celsius. So it's very cold. That's just a random fact.
All the best to that journey here in Nairobi. Here in Nairobi, it's really, really hot. I don't even know what's happening. Also, as we wrap up, could you read the poem once more, right before we close?
Yes, I would. I would love to.
Right before Courage reads the poem, I would just like to thank everyone for joining us today evening. Thank you for your contributions. And yeah, thank you. Thank you for all being here. In the chat, you will see you can send your feedback to our email, and you can send us more questions. Please be sure to follow Postbox Ghana for more updates. And yeah, thank you everyone. Yeah, Courage, take it away.
Okay, so I will read this poem by the Ghanaian poet Kofi Awono, who was unfortunately killed in 2013 in the Al-Shabaab attacks at the Westgate Mall in Nairobi, Kenya. The poem is titled The Cathedral, and I will read it now. On this dirty patch, a tree once stood, shedding incense on the infant corn, its boughs stretched across the heaven, brightened by the last fires of a tribe. They sent surveyors and builders who cut that tree, planting in its place a huge, senseless cathedral of doom. Thank you.